Hello and welcome to this Revit Basics series for MEP. This video goes over the Revit interface, navigation, and infrastructure. We'll dive into concepts like the different views you can make in Revit, how to manipulate them, and how to deal with parameters and families. A few disclaimers. In the interest of only showing what we believe will be useful to the most people, there are several things we will not be talking about in these videos. We're not going into great depth about architectural stuff or creating a model from scratch. It's assumed you'll be working from an architectural model that was provided. We're also not doing any really deep dives into any of these concepts. These videos are meant to be a sort of quick start guide, so if you need to dive deep into any of these concepts, there are other resources dedicated to that. Finally, we will not be doing much actual MEP stuff in these videos. I don't know what discipline you are. I don't want to show you stuff that is not relevant to your discipline. So again, there are dedicated resources you can find for that. We'll start at the home screen. This is what it generally looks like. You can open or create models and families using the sidebar. More on what families are in just a bit. You can also pick from a recent model or family. So let's check out the sample project. I'm most familiar with electrical, so we'll use the electrical sample. Over here, we have the project browser, which, as the name implies, lets you browse through the various views, schedules, and other parts of your project. You can expand and collapse categories, use the search bar. You can also right-click on a top-level category like Views and select Browser Organization to modify how everything is categorized. Let's find a floor plan to show off some of the other features. Above the project browser, we have the Properties palette, where you can view and modify information about the stuff in your model. If you have nothing selected, it displays properties for the current view. If you select something on the model, it displays properties for the selection. Note that some of the displayed properties are grayed out, indicating they can't be changed here. That usually means it's a property defined in the template or family. We'll look at families a little later. For things you can change, select the value, make the change, then, and this is the important part, move your cursor off the palette. Revit interprets that cursor movement as you saying, I'm okay with this, save my changes, and update the model. I'm also mentioning that so you'll know what's happening if you're ever trying to change something. You move the cursor so you can see what you're typing, then it deselects the property before you're finished typing. Next, let's talk about the various ribbons. The architecture ribbon is pretty self-explanatory. That's where a lot of your architecture commands live. The structure, steel, and precast ribbons are for your structural engineers. The systems ribbon is where the MEP commands live. That's your pipes, your ductwork and diffusers, your electrical equipment and conduits, and so on. The insert ribbon is where you find commands for importing files and managing the files that you have imported. The annotate ribbon is for marking elements with dimension labels, text, tags, and so on. The analyze ribbon is for your calculation reports for each discipline, such as your structural loads, your panel schedules for electrical load calcs, and your energy and pressure loss reports for mechanical. This is also where you define spaces, which we'll talk about in the next video. The massing and site ribbon, again, fairly self-explanatory. That's for your architectural masses and your site modeling. The collaborate ribbon, also kind of self-explanatory, commands to collaborate with the other users at your company. We'll go over some of the commands on this ribbon in a later video. The view ribbon is for creating and modifying your views as well as some of the Revit UI. This is also where you have commands to make legends, sheets, schedules, drafting views, and so on. The Manage ribbon is, of course, for managing the settings in your project. The Add-ins ribbon is where some add-ins for Revit will live. By default, Revit comes with eTransmit and Formit. Additional add-ins may use this ribbon, or they may manifest in other ways that we'll talk about in a later video. The Modify ribbon is for making measurements, for moving things around, making copies, mirrors, arrays, and so on. Finally, you have contextual ribbons that will appear when you have things selected that are relevant to the selection. For instance, if we select a panel, there's a contextual ribbon for modifying the equipment and for modifying the circuit. Now, as an MEP professional, you may not need all of these ribbons, and Revit does allow you to remove the ones that you don't need. To do that, go to File, Options, and User Interface. From here, you can select and deselect specific panels on the ribbons or certain ribbons entirely. Uncheck the boxes, press OK. When you restart Revit, those ribbons or panels will be gone. Something to note when dealing with the commands on the ribbons, most will have a keyboard shortcut that you can see by hovering over the command. You can see for the Move command, the keyboard shortcut is MV. So if you type MV on your keyboard, you can see it runs that command. Let's talk a bit about navigating the different Revit views. We'll cover creation and modification in a later video. For now, this is just familiarizing you with the controls to get around your views. First, a quick overview of the different view types. There are plan views, which have a few subtypes. First is the floor plan, which is what's currently open. As you can see, it's a top-down view of the floor and things inserted on it. There are also reflected ceiling plans, which, rather than looking down at the floor, look up at the ceiling to place light fixtures, HVAC diffusers, etc. We have 3D views, which, as the name implies, show a three-dimensional model. I don't know that you'll spend a ton of time designing in a 3D view, but it can be helpful to see how your design will look in the real world, or if you need to find something and you're not sure which floor it's on. You have section views to see those cross sections for certain parts of your design. You have elevation views, which are kind of a mix of the 3D and section views and show the entire model from a specified side. They're mostly useful for adjusting the levels in the model, which we'll talk about in the next video. Finally, we have drafting views, which, as you might have guessed, are where you draw things. So your single line diagram for electrical, any schematics that might need to be included for the other disciplines, those would go in a drafting view. By default, movement in Revit is controlled through the scroll wheel on your mouse. Scroll forward and back to zoom in and out, and click and drag to pan. You can also do a quick zoom extents or zoom to fit by double-clicking on the scroll wheel. If you're in the 3D view, you can hold down Shift, then click and drag to adjust the viewing angle. You can also use the View cube to drag the viewing angle, or to select a preset angle. To select a single element in the view, left-click on the element. You can also click and drag to select multiple elements. Dragging to the right will select anything fully inside the bounding box. Dragging to the left will select anything that is touching the bounding box. In the lower left, we have controls for modifying the current view. We'll just look at some of the more common functions. We'll start with this one, temporary view properties. Depending on the view and the template it's using, some of these controls will be locked. Enabling a temporary view opens those up without saving any of the changes we make. On the far left is the drawing scale. That's the ratio that says if I were to print this on a physical sheet, what does an inch or a partial inch on that physical sheet represent for the plan? That will control your annotative elements, so your text, your diagrammatic lines and symbols, and so on. We'll look at that a little more in a later video. For now, just know that when you're in a floor plan, that's where that control lives. Next, we have the level of detail, which controls how much complexity Revit uses to display the elements in the model. For MEP, you generally don't need to see things like, for instance, the handle and logo on the front of a dishwasher. And if you have to ask Revit to render a lot of those fiddly bits, it can really slow the software down. So it's generally recommended you keep the detail level to medium or coarse. Similarly, we have the visual style. Again, the further down the list you go, the harder Revit has to work, so it's recommended you stick to the most basic view that gives you the information you need and isn't too visually complicating. I prefer hidden line because it's a lower level of detail, similar to wireframe, but it hides any lines that could be covered up by, say, a wall or the top of this pole box. Next are controls for cropping. You can use this to isolate a view to just what's relevant. Select Show Crop Region to show the crop outline. Select it, and drag it into place. You can use the Edit Crop command to change the shape if needed. Once the crop region is in place, you can use the Crop View toggle to turn it on and off. We'll go to the 3D view for this next one. Let's say you have a complex view like this one and you just need to get some stuff out of the way. I'll select one of the linked models, then use the temporary hide and isolate. I can select hide element to just hide this linked model, or I can select hide category to hide all of the linked models in this view. You can also do the inverse with isolate element and isolate category. The apply and reset options allow you to make the changes permanent for the view or reset the view. Beside that is a toggle to show hidden elements, pretty straightforward. And finally, on the other side of the temporary view properties is a toggle for your analytical model. Again, pretty straightforward. It shows highlights for areas that you've defined using commands on the Analyze ribbon. Again, there are a few of these buttons I skipped, but these are the ones you're most likely to use when navigating your views in Revit. The Revit model is made up of elements, whether we are talking about views, sheets, or architectural and mechanical devices. Each element has properties you can set, as we saw in the Properties palette earlier. Revit refers to these properties as parameters, and there are a few different kinds. The one you'll use the most are type and instance parameters, which are defined on elements and their families. Type parameters are for properties intrinsic to that type of element. For example, if this particular panel board is 100 amps, the box will always have these dimensions. If you had a family for a piece of 2x4, those width and thickness dimensions would be the same for every 2x4 in the project. Because those values are intrinsic, they can't be changed for an individual element, so they don't appear in the Properties palette when the element is selected. Instance parameters, on the other hand, are those things you can change for individual elements. For a panel, it could be the number of breakers or the mounting. For a 2x4, it could be the length. We'll go into more detail about how you can create and modify those parameters in a moment when we talk about families. Something to note, if you wanted to create a new parameter for, say, all the different electrical equipment in your project, or set a parameter to the same value for a bunch of your ducts or pipes, it could take a while to do that for every family or every element in the project. You can speed that up a bit with project, global, and shared parameters. Project parameters are a quick and easy way to define a parameter and populate it for every element of a certain type in this project. For example, this project has a sheet group parameter that will automatically be populated for every sheet in the project. Without having it as a project parameter, some of the sheets might have a parameter and some might not. Global parameters, if you're familiar with programming, work like global variables. You set a value here, such as hello world. Then you can select an element and click this box beside a parameter to have it use that value. If the global parameter changes later, everything associated with it will also change. Finally, shared parameters are parameters that are stored in a separate file so that you and other people at your company can define a parameter once, then reuse it on different families and in different projects without having to create the parameter from scratch every time. So, we've talked about families a fair bit. What is a family and what can you do with it? A family is essentially the template for a thing you can put in your model, whether it's an air handler, a toilet, a panel, a light fixture, a table, etc. That also includes annotative elements like tags. The properties for those tags are stored in a family. If you need to make changes to something so those changes will be reflected every time you put that thing in your model, the family is where you can make those changes. To modify a family, you could open it from the home screen, but oftentimes the best way to do it is to select an instance of that family and run the Edit Family command. I say this is the best way for two reasons. One, it's just easier to point and say, I want to edit this one, than to dig through your library looking for the appropriate file for that family. Two, once you put an instance of that family in the model, the project stores that definition, that snapshot of what the family looked like in that moment. If someone has made changes to the file since then, it won't show up in this definition in your project. Also, you may want to make changes to this family, but only for this project. You can only do that if you are opening the project definition instead of the file. So, using Edit Family, make sure you're editing the family as it exists in this project. When we run the Edit Family command, it opens the family in a separate view. As I mentioned before, I won't go into exhaustive detail about dealing with families, such as creation or in-depth customization, for a few reasons. Again, these videos are meant to be quick start guides. You can find dedicated resources if you really want to know the nitty-gritty of how to deal with making these families and customizing them in great depth. Second, when you're working with MEP devices and fixtures, you can usually find families for those things already, either in the Revit and Autodesk libraries or online. If you have a particular brand in mind, most of the bigger companies will actually have Revit families publicly available that are modeled after those specific products. You might need to tweak some things to make it work for your company and your project, but it's very rare that you will need to make a family for something entirely from scratch. So, with that out of the way, let's do a quick overview of the Model Family UI. As you can see, when you have a family open, the UI changes a bit. The ribbons now have commands specifically for working in model families. There's the Create ribbon, where your fabrication commands live, as well as other commands that dictate how the element behaves in the model view. The Insert ribbon same as in the model for importing other files into the family. The annotate ribbon, again, same as the model view for making your annotations. The view ribbon, again, self-explanatory, little similar. The commands on this ribbon can also be used to control the visibility settings for how this family will look when it is actually in the project, as opposed to how it looks when you have the family itself open. The manage ribbon is largely the same as it is in the project. It's where you keep up with your parameters, styles, scripts, and so on. And again, the modify ribbon for moving, copying, rotating, etc. And you still have your context menus when you have something selected. At the bottom, we have many of the same commands as in the model, where you can set your scale, your detail level, hide and show things, etc. If you're messing around with the visibility settings on that view ribbon, you can use this last button to preview how that will reflect in the model. Over in the project browser, you can look at the different views in this family. For example, this opened on the 3D view, but it also has a floor plan view where you can see the annotation symbol that will be displayed for this receptacle on floor plans. While we're here, let's talk about nested families. That is, you can insert instances of other families into a family. And when you crack open the top level family, you can dive further down into those nested ones. So we'll select the symbol and run Edit Family again to take a look at this one. You'll notice the Create ribbon looks a little different here. That's because this is an annotation family as opposed to a model family. So it's more about drawing lines and making masks rather than doing extrusions and placing connectors that you would use in the model. Going back to the receptacle family proper, let's take a look at a few of the most commonly used commands and how you can use those to modify your families. On the Create ribbon, we have the connector commands, which are important for a few functions. For one, they act kind of like snap points when you're drawing ductwork, pipes, cable trays, or conduit to the device. And for these first three connectors, those connectors are where you store a lot of critical information. For electrical, that's where you set voltage and how much load is on the device. For mechanical, things like the amount and direction of flow are set on those connectors. So if you need to set those values, you need to select a connector already on the family or create one using one of those commands. On the Create ribbon, as well as on the Modify ribbon, we have the Family Category and Family Types commands. The first command, pretty simple, is where you set what sort of thing this family represents. The values you can set in this family and the things you can do with it in the model depend on this category, so it needs to be correct for the element. Again, using electrical as an example, if I want the load on this receptacle to actually show up in my load calculations when I have a bunch of them circuited to a panel, they need to be electrical fixtures. If they're categorized as electrical equipment, then they behave more like panels. And as far as Revit is concerned, panels cannot generate load themselves. They only have load that is put on them from other devices. The second command is where you can define the parameters that exist in this family and what the values should be. Remember earlier when I explained the type and instance parameters? This is where you can specify which of those you want each parameter to be. If it's a type parameter, the value will be hard set for that family type. You can use the drop-down at the top of the previous dialog box to see which types are available, create and remove types, and set the values for each. If this is an instance parameter, you can set the default value at the family. Notice how it says default here. But once it's in the model, you can adjust it as needed for each instance. Finally, we have the load into project commands, which allow you to load the active family into another family or project. Both commands pretty much work the same. The second, just as the name implies, closes the family for you after it loads the family in. So if you were finished with it, you're going to close it anyway. Running the command saves you a click. There are a few factors that affect how this command behaves. If you just have this family and one other file open, when you run the command, it loads the family into that other file automatically. If you have more files open, it will instead bring up a list of open files and ask where you want the family to be loaded. So if it brings up that list, make sure it's going to the right place. If the family does not exist in the destination file, it will get loaded, then you'll be prompted to insert the family immediately. If it does exist, you'll get this warning asking if you want to overwrite the existing definition with the changes you made. Option 2 overwrites everything. Every instance of this family will revert to the new default state in the family. Option 1 will still overwrite most things, but it doesn't touch any of the values assigned to parameters. So if you had changed a receptacle in particular to have a higher load, Option 2 would overwrite that change with the default load from the family. Option 1 does not. That does it for the first part of this Revit Basics series for MEP. In the next video, we'll go over how to set up things like levels and spaces in a new model, creating sheets and schedules, importing and exporting files, and more. See you there.